So, Emma, do you like the house I bought you? My grandfather's voice cut through the dinner table chatter like a knife, and I nearly choked on my water. I set down my glass carefully, searching his face for some sign that I'd misheard him, but his blue eyes were bright with expectation, waiting for my answer. What house? I managed to say, confusion washing over me in waves, and I watched as my mother's fork clattered against her plate, her face draining of color so quickly I thought she might faint. My father suddenly became very interested in his pot roast, cutting it into smaller and smaller pieces, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Madison, my younger sister, looked up from her phone for the first time since we'd sat down, her perfectly shaped eyebrows raised in what might have been genuine surprise. What do you mean? What house? Grandpa's smile faltered, uncertainty creeping into his expression as he glanced around the table at my parents. The house. The three-bedroom Craftsman on Maple Street. I've been writing you about it for months, sweetheart. Didn't you get my letters? I shook my head slowly, that familiar sinking feeling settling into my stomach. The one I'd carried my entire 28 years of life. The one that told me I was about to discover yet another way I'd been overlooked, forgotten, dismissed. I didn't get any letters, Grandpa. I don't know anything about a house. The confusion on his face transformed into something harder, something that made him sit up straighter in his chair as he turned to look at my mother. Barbara, I sent 6 letters to your address. I specifically asked you to make sure Emma got them. Where are they? The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the sound of the kitchen clock ticking away the seconds. This was my life, I thought. This constant state of being on the outside of my own family, watching as opportunities and gifts and love itself seemed to flow around me like water around a stone, always toward Madison, always away from me. I lived in a 400-square-foot apartment in a neighborhood where I heard gunshots at least twice a week, where my car had been broken into 3 times in the past year, where I worked double shifts at the hospital and came home too exhausted to do anything but collapse into bed. Meanwhile, Madison lived in a luxury apartment that my parents paid for, posting photos of her breakfast smoothies and her outfit of the day to her 60,000 Instagram followers, calling herself an influencer and an entrepreneur while producing exactly $0 of actual income. I'd stopped expecting things to be different years ago, had learned to swallow the disappointment like bitter medicine, but sitting there watching my mother's face cycle through panic and calculation and something that looked almost like guilt, I felt something crack open inside my chest. My grandfather's hands were shaking as he set down his water glass, and I'd never seen him look like this before, his face flushed with an emotion I couldn't quite name, but that made my father shift uncomfortably in his seat. 6 months, Barbara, Grandpa said, his voice dangerously quiet in that way that meant he was truly angry, not just annoyed. I sent 6 letters over 6 months about the house. The 3-bedroom Craftsman on Maple Street, fully paid, $380,000 in Emma's name. I told you about the hardwood floors, the updated kitchen, the garden, the safe neighborhood only 15 minutes from her hospital. I asked you to make sure she got every single letter because I wanted her to know someone was thinking about her, someone saw how hard she was working. The number hit me like a physical blow. $380,000, a house, a real house that someone had bought for me, and I felt Madison's eyes on me, her shock seeming genuine for once as she looked between Grandpa and our mother. I wanted to give it to Emma because she reminds me so much of your grandmother, Grandpa continued, and his voice cracked slightly on the words. Hard-working, compassionate, always putting everyone else first. Never complaining even when she should. Never asking for help, even when she desperately needed it. Your grandmother spent 40 years being underappreciated by her own family before I met her, and I promised myself I'd never let anyone feel invisible like that again. But here I am, sitting at this table, realizing I let it happen right under my nose. My mother had gone completely pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, and my father was still performing surgery on his pot roast, cutting it into pieces so small they might as well have been atoms. "Where are the letters, Barbara?" Grandpa asked again, and the steel in his voice was unmistakable. My mind was reeling, spinning through the implications, through the familiar pattern I'd learned to recognize since I was old enough to understand that some children got different treatment than others. I remembered being 16, watching Madison open the keys to a brand new Honda Civic, cherry red with a bow on top like something from a commercial, while I stood there with a $50 gift card to Target in my hand, being told that I needed to learn responsibility and that Madison needed reliable transportation for her social commitments. I remembered my 18th birthday when Madison, only 14 at the time, had gotten a surprise party with 200 guests at a rented venue, while my celebration had been dinner at Olive Garden with breadsticks and a card. The pattern was there, had always been there, written in 1,000 small cruelties and oversights that I'd taught myself to accept as normal. Because what choice did I have? What else could I do but swallow the hurt and keep going, keep trying to earn the love that seemed to come so effortlessly to my sister? My mother's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper, but in the dead silence of that dining room, it carried perfectly to every ear. "I intercepted the letters," she said, and I watched her hands twist the napkin in her lap into a tortured knot of fabric. I didn't want Emma to get ideas above her station. She has a perfectly adequate apartment and a stable job. The house should go to Madison, who has an image to maintain, who needs it for her brand, for her business. The words landed like physical blows, each one confirming what I'd always suspected but never wanted to believe, that my own mother actively worked to keep opportunities away from me, that it wasn't just neglect or oversight, but deliberate sabotage. Grandpa's face went from flushed to nearly purple, and he pushed back from the table so hard his chair scraped against the hardwood floor with a sound like a scream. "Your brand?" he repeated, his voice rising with each word. "Barbara, this is my money, my choice, my granddaughter who works herself to exhaustion saving lives while you worry about Instagram photos." My father finally looked up from his massacred pot roast, his face a mask of weak protest. "Dad, you need to understand. Madison is at a critical point in her career development, and Emma has always been so independent. She doesn't really need help the way Madison does." I felt something breaking inside me, some last fragile hope that maybe I'd misunderstood all these years, that maybe there was some explanation that would make it all make sense. But no, here it was, laid bare in my mother's own words and my father's pathetic justifications. "Independent?" Grandpa's laugh was bitter, harsh. "You gave Madison $50,000 for her wedding 2 years ago. $50,000 for one day, for flowers, and a dress, and a party. You gave Emma $500 and told her to be grateful. Do you remember that, Barbara?" I remembered it. Remembered standing in my parents' living room while my mother handed me the card with the check inside. Remembered her saying that they'd helped pay for my nursing school, so I shouldn't expect as much as Madison was getting. Conveniently forgetting that they'd complained about every single tuition payment, while simultaneously funding Madison's $30,000 gap year in Europe, where she'd supposedly been finding herself, but had mostly been posting photos of croissants in the Eiffel Tower. I remembered not being invited to the family vacation to Hawaii 3 years ago, my mother explaining on the phone that it was just going to be a small trip and they didn't want me to have to take time off work. While the photos Madison posted showed my parents, my aunt and uncle, even my cousins, everyone but me building sandcastles and snorkeling and toasting with Mai Tais at sunset. I remembered my graduation dinner from nursing school being canceled the day before because Madison had a photo shoot that my parents simply had to attend, because 10,000 Instagram followers was apparently more important than celebrating my 4 years of exhausting work and academic achievement that had landed me in the top 3% of my class. Grandpa stood up from the table, his chair scraping against the floor with a finality that made everyone freeze, and he looked directly at me for the first time since the awful revelations had started spilling out into the open. "Emma, I'm taking you to see the house tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. I'll pick you up at your apartment." My mother's fork clattered against her plate, the sound sharp and panicked in the thick silence. Richard, you can't just do this. You're going to tear this family apart. You're going to cause so much unnecessary drama. Grandpa turned to her with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, something cold and final and absolutely unmovable. Barbara, the drama already exists. I just didn't see it until tonight. You created this situation by lying to me for 6 months, by stealing from your own daughter, by treating her like she matters less than yesterday's newspaper. I'm not causing anything. I'm fixing what I should have fixed years ago. The validation hit me like a wave, unexpected and overwhelming. This feeling of someone actually standing up for me, actually seeing the hurt, and calling it what it was, instead of telling me I was too sensitive, or asking why I couldn't just be happy for my sister. My father tried one more weak protest, something about family unity and not making rash decisions, but Grandpa silenced him with a look and told me he'd see me in the morning. And then he left, walking out of my parents' house with his shoulders straight and his purpose clear, leaving the rest of us sitting in the wreckage of a dinner that had exposed wounds I'd spent 28 years pretending didn't hurt as much as they did. I left shortly after, driving back to my tiny apartment in the neighborhood where I heard gunshots at least once a week and kept my pepper spray on my nightstand. And I lay awake for hours that night, my mind cycling through memories I'd tried so hard to bury. I was 12 years old again, standing on the stage at the regional science fair with my first place ribbon, scanning the audience for my parents' faces and not finding them because they were at Madison's dance recital across town, the third one that month, watching her perform a 2-minute routine while I accepted an award for 3 months of research on water purification systems. I was 18, opening my acceptance letter to the state's most prestigious nursing program, a program with a 92% board exam pass rate and connections to every major hospital in the region. And hearing my mother sigh about the cost, about the inconvenience, about whether I really needed such an expensive education when the community college had a perfectly adequate nursing program. This while they were writing a check for $30,000 to fund Madison's gap year in Europe, where she'd promised to find direction, but had mostly found expensive cafes and photo opportunities. I was 25, exhausted beyond measure, working double shifts during the pandemic because the hospital was drowning in patients and we were so desperately short-staffed that I was doing the work of 3 nurses, coming home after 16-hour days to collapse in my scrubs because I was too tired to even shower, and calling my mother for just a moment of sympathy, just some acknowledgement that this was hard. And hearing her talk for 45 minutes about how worried she was about Madison because all her influencer events were canceled and she was struggling with the isolation and didn't. I think that was just so difficult for someone with Madison's sensitive nature. Grandpa picked me up at 9 o'clock exactly, his old Buick idling at the curb outside my apartment building, where Mrs. Chen from 3B was already sweeping broken glass from another car window smash-up, the third one this month, and I climbed into the passenger seat feeling like I was stepping into a dream that might evaporate if I acknowledged it too directly. He had a manila folder on the dashboard, thick with papers, and before he even pulled away from the curb, he opened it and started showing me everything, his voice quiet but steady as he explained what my mother had stolen from me. 6 letters, all addressed to my parents' house, because he'd thought that was safer than my apartment building where the mailboxes got broken into regularly. 6 months of correspondence about the house he'd bought for me, about the inspection and the closing and the deed transfer, and his hopes that I would love it. He showed me photos printed on regular computer paper, slightly grainy but clear enough that I could see the details. A beautiful craftsman-style house with a deep front porch and hanging ferns, hardwood floors visible through the front windows, a garden bed along the side that looked like it had been recently mulched. Everything about it speaking of care and permanence and safety. "I bought it specifically for you," Grandpa said, and his voice cracked slightly on the words. "After Christmas, you remember? You mentioned your apartment building in passing, said something about hearing sirens every night, and how your downstairs neighbor had been robbed. You laughed it off like it was just part of city living, but Emma, sweetheart, I saw your face. You were scared. You've been scared for years, and I couldn't stand the thought of you living like that when I had the means to change it. The tears came before I could stop them, hot and overwhelming, because someone had actually listened to me, actually heard the thing I'd said so casually, because I'd learned long ago not to complain too loudly about my problems, not to ask for help that would never come, and he'd taken that throwaway comment and turned it into this extraordinary gift. I cried in his passenger seat while he showed me photos of the kitchen with its white subway tile and butcher block counters, the 3 bedrooms with their big windows, the basement that had been finished into a den, the small backyard with its old oak tree and wooden fence, all of it purchased and paid for and sitting empty for 6 months while my mother intercepted his letters and kept me in the dark. I'm sorry I didn't send them directly to your apartment, Grandpa said, reaching over to pat my hand. I thought the family address would be safer, more reliable. I trusted them to pass along my messages. I didn't realize Barbara would. He trailed off, his jaw tightening with an anger I rarely saw in him. I didn't realize she'd been intercepting your mail for months, stealing from both of us. He put the car in drive, and we headed across the city toward the neighborhood he'd shown me in the photos. And I sat there clutching those printed pictures, like they were proof of something I'd needed my whole life, evidence that I mattered to someone, that I was worth more than being overlooked and dismissed and forgotten. The house was perfect in a way that made my chest ache with something I couldn't quite name, something between grief and hope and disbelief that this could actually be mine. Grandpa pulled up to a tree-lined street about 15 minutes from the hospital where I worked, a neighborhood I'd driven through dozens of times on my way to grab coffee or run errands, never imagining I could actually afford to live here. And he parked in front of a craftsman-style home with a deep front porch and pale blue siding that looked freshly painted. We walked up the front steps together, and he pulled out a set of keys, 3 of them on a simple ring, and handed them to me before I'd even crossed the threshold, pressing them into my palm like he wanted me to understand that this was real, that this wasn't something that could be taken away. The front door opened into a living room with hardwood floors that gleamed in the morning light, crown molding along the ceiling, built-in bookshelves flanking a fireplace that looked original to the house. And I stood there just breathing, trying to absorb that this space existed, and someone thought I deserved it. The kitchen had white subway tile backsplash and butcher block counters, and a window over the sink that looked out onto the backyard, and there was a washer and dryer in an actual laundry room instead of the coin-operated machines in a basement that smelled like mildew and sometimes didn't work even after you'd fed them $5 in quarters. 3 bedrooms upstairs, the master with an attached bathroom that had a tub deep enough to actually relax in, and I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls like I needed physical confirmation that they were solid. Grandpa followed me quietly, letting me process, and when we got back downstairs to the kitchen, he pulled out another envelope from his jacket pocket, this one containing a bank statement, and he handed it to me with an expression that was both proud and sad. I've been putting $500 a month into an account for you since you started nursing school, he said, and I looked down at the balance printed on the paper and saw $30,000 I'd never known existed. Your mother intercepted the statements too. I sent them to the house along with notes explaining that this was for your future, for a down payment or emergency fund or whatever you needed to feel secure, and Barbara never told you. My hands shook holding that statement, doing the math in my head. 5 years of monthly deposits while I'd struggled to buy groceries and driven a car with a check engine light that had been on for 2 years because I couldn't afford the repair, and slept in an apartment where I kept my nursing school loans deferred because I was sending $200 a month to my parents who claimed they desperately needed help with bills. Grandpa's voice was gentle but firm when he continued. Emma, sweetheart, I've always seen how they treated you. I saw it, and I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that parents have the right to raise their children as they see fit. But I drew the line at respecting their autonomy when I realized they weren't just favoring Madison, they were actively sabotaging you, stealing from you, keeping you in the dark about resources that were meant to change your life. I stood in that beautiful kitchen with the deed to a house worth $380,000 in one hand and a bank statement showing $30,000 in savings in the other, and I let myself imagine what my life could have been if my mother hadn't intercepted every attempt my grandfather had made to help me. If I'd known 5 years ago that someone was building a safety net beneath me. If I'd been able to sleep at night without hearing gunshots in the distance, and wondering if my car would start in the morning, and calculating whether I could afford both groceries and gas this week. Grandpa insisted on a family meeting that evening at his house, his voice on the phone carrying a steel I'd rarely heard from him, and though my stomach twisted with anxiety at the thought of facing everyone again so soon, I knew he needed this confrontation to happen while the evidence was fresh, and his anger was righteous enough to override years of conflict avoidance. I drove to his house at 6 o'clock, my hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel, and found that he'd assembled everyone, the whole family gathered in his formal dining room, like we were about to have some kind of intervention, which I supposed we were, though not the kind anyone had been expecting. My parents sat on one side of the long mahogany table, my mother's face carefully blank in that way she had when she was preparing her defenses, my father looking uncomfortable and slightly bewildered, like he wasn't entirely sure how we'd arrived at this moment. Madison was there with her husband Trevor, who I'd always liked despite everything, because he seemed genuinely kind and had a real job in finance and had never treated me like I was less than, and she looked anxious, her hands twisting in her lap, probably already knowing this wasn't going to be pleasant. Aunt Carol and Uncle Jim sat near the far end, my father's sister and her husband, and I felt a small rush of relief seeing them, because Aunt Carol had always been kind to me in quiet ways I hadn't fully appreciated until now. Grandpa had even called his lawyer, Mr. Richardson, who'd handled the house purchase, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and reading glasses perched on his nose, and his presence made everything feel official and serious and irreversible. Grandpa stood at the head of the table and presented his timeline methodically, showing the letters he'd sent about the house over 6 months, the bank statements for the account he'd been funding, the dates and details of every attempt he'd made to help me that had been intercepted and hidden, and he asked my parents directly to explain themselves, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of profound disappointment. My mother's defensiveness surfaced immediately, her spine straightening as she said, Emma never needed help because she had a stable job and could take care of herself, while Madison was building an empire and needed support during the growth phase, and the words came out practiced, like she'd been rehearsing this justification for months, maybe years, trying to make the inequality sound reasonable and measured, instead of cruel. My father nodded along weakly, adding that they'd just been trying to help where help was needed most, and I sat there watching them rewrite history in real time, turning their favoritism into strategic resource allocation, their neglect into respect for my independence, their theft into family financial planning. Grandpa's voice cut through my mother's justifications like a surgical blade, calm and precise and utterly devastating as he said, Emma has a stable job because she worked 3 jobs simultaneously through nursing school, while you paid for Madison's entire college education, and her gap year in Europe, and her apartment and her car. So let's not pretend her stability is anything other than what she built herself with no help from you. And I watched my mother's face tighten as he continued dismantling her logic piece by piece. Madison's empire, as you call it, has produced exactly $0 in actual income in the 4 years since she started this influencer career. Isn't that right? Grandpa looked at Madison, not unkindly, and she nodded miserably, tears already starting to form in her eyes. She's 26 years old and has never supported herself for a single month of her adult life. And that's not her fault. That's yours. Because you've enabled her into a lifestyle that isn't sustainable and convinced her that Instagram photos are a substitute for actual employment. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and I could see him wanting to argue, but not quite able to find the words. And then Grandpa turned to me and asked, "Emma, sweetheart, you've been sending your parents $200 a month for the past 2 years. Is that correct?" And I nodded, my throat too tight to speak, remembering all the times I'd skipped meals or delayed buying new scrubs because I'd needed to send that money home, because my parents had told me they were struggling with bills and I couldn't bear the thought of them losing their house. Grandpa looked back at my parents and said, 2 years, 200 a month, that's $4,800 that Emma has sent you from her nursing salary while working 12-hour shifts and living in an apartment so dangerous she heard gunshots at night, money you told her you desperately needed to keep the lights on. And then his voice went even quieter, even more dangerous. Where did that money go? My father's face went red and he stared at the table, and my mother opened her mouth and closed it again. And finally my father said, barely audible, "We used it for Madison's business expenses, the photography equipment, and the ring light, and the trips she needed to take for content, and some of the designer pieces she said were necessary for her brand." And I felt something crack open inside my chest, something that had been holding together through sheer force of will. My grocery money had bought my sister's Instagram aesthetic. My savings, scraped together from extra shifts and skipped lunches and buying the cheapest possible everything, had funded photo shoots in locations I would never be able to afford to visit myself. Aunt Carol made a small sound of horror, and Uncle Jim shook his head slowly. And Madison was crying openly now, saying, "I didn't know, Emma. I swear I didn't know. They told me they were helping me get started, and I thought they were using their own money. I never would have accepted it if I'd known it was coming from you." And I believed her because Madison had always been thoughtless rather than cruel, enabled into self-centeredness by parents who had never required her to think about anyone else's needs. Trevor cleared his throat, and everyone's attention shifted to him. Madison's husband, who I'd always appreciated because he had a real career and treated people with basic decency. And he said, "I'm sorry, I need to understand something, because this is the first I'm hearing that Emma was sending you money every month." And he looked at my parents with genuine confusion on his face. "For the past 2 years, you've been telling me that you were supporting Madison financially while she built her platform, that you were covering her expenses as an investment in her future, but now I'm learning that Emma was sending you money that you then used for Madison's expenses?" My father started to respond, but stumbled over his words, his face flushing darker, and my mother jumped in with, "It's more complicated than that. We had various income streams and expenses. It's not like we directly transferred Emma's money to Madison, it all went into the household accounts." But Trevor shook his head and said, "That's the same thing. That's literally the same thing. You took money from your daughter who was working 12-hour nursing shifts and used it to fund your other daughter's hobby." And Madison put her hand on his arm, but he gently moved it away, his financial analyst brain clearly working through the implications. Grandpa let the silence hang for a moment, and then said, "That's not even the worst of it." And I felt my stomach drop, because I didn't know what else there could possibly be. What other betrayals were waiting to be unearthed from the wreckage of my relationship with my parents? "Emma, do you remember your nursing school graduation 4 years ago, when you finished top of your class?" I nodded, remembering that bittersweet day when I'd achieved something I was genuinely proud of, but had celebrated alone because my parents had said they couldn't make it. "I sent you $5,000 as a graduation gift," Grandpa said, and I felt the room tilt slightly, because I had never received $5,000, had never even known such a gift existed. "I sent a check to your parents' house with a card explaining it was for you, to help you get started in your career, maybe put toward a reliable car or first month's rent on a decent apartment." He looked at my parents, and his voice carried a weight of profound disappointment. "They told me you'd declined the money, that you'd insisted it should go to Madison instead for her wedding dress, because you wanted your sister to have a beautiful wedding, and you didn't need the money since you had a job lined up." I couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I was hearing. $5,000 that could have changed everything for me in those early months of my career, when I was sleeping on a friend's couch and taking the bus 2 hours each way to the hospital because I couldn't afford a car. I never knew, I whispered, and Grandpa nodded sadly. And your nursing school award ceremony, the one where you received the clinical excellence recognition, I had planned to attend, but your parents told me it had been canceled due to COVID protocols. My mother's face had gone completely white, and my father was staring at the table like he wanted to disappear into it. It wasn't canceled, I said, my voice barely audible, remembering standing on that stage accepting my award and scanning the small, socially distanced audience, hoping somehow my family had surprised me, finding only my classmates' relatives. They went to Madison's influencer convention in Atlanta that weekend, Aunt Carol said quietly, and everyone looked at her. I saw the photos on Facebook. My mother's composure finally shattered completely, and she started crying in a way I'd never seen before. Her hands covering her face as her shoulders shook, and when she looked up, her makeup was smeared, and her eyes were red, and she said in a broken voice, "I always favored Madison because Emma never needed me. Don't you understand? From the time she was little, Emma was just so capable and independent, and she never asked for help. She never cried when she fell down. She never came to me with her problems. She just handled everything herself. And Madison was so sensitive and fragile, and she needed me. She needed her mother. And I thought Emma was fine because she always seemed fine." The words hung in the air like poison, and I felt something shift in my understanding, because this was the truth, finally, the real reason beneath all the excuses and justifications. My mother had favored the child who needed her and punished the one who had learned not to need anyone. Grandpa's voice was gentle but firm when he said, "Did it ever occur to you that you created that dynamic, that Emma became independent because every time she needed something, she was denied, that she learned to stop asking because asking resulted in disappointment, that you trained her not to need you and then resented her for the very self-sufficiency you forced on her?" And my mother shook her head like she couldn't accept this, but I could see in my father's face that Grandpa's words were landing, that maybe for the first time, he was actually seeing the pattern they'd created. "Madison needed support because you never required her to be independent," Grandpa continued, looking at my sister with something like pity. "You enabled her into a state of perpetual helplessness because it made you feel necessary, feel important, and Emma, you left to raise herself because she had the misfortune of being competent." Aunt Carol spoke up then, her voice quiet but clear, and she said, "I noticed the difference in how you treated them years ago, probably when Emma was about 15 and Madison was 13, and I tried to help in small ways without interfering in your parenting." And she looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I paid for some of your textbooks in nursing school. Do you remember the semester when 3 of them just showed up at your apartment with a note saying they were from the bookstore's scholarship program?" I nodded, remembering that miracle when I'd been trying to figure out how to afford the required materials. And Aunt Carol continued, "That was me, and the set of scrubs you found on your doorstep, and the grocery store gift cards that appeared in your mailbox around the holidays. I saw how they treated you, and I couldn't fix it, but I could try to help a little." The realization washed over me that the small kindnesses I'd attributed to luck or the generosity of strangers had actually been my aunt, witnessing my mistreatment and doing what she could within the family dynamic. And I felt grateful and heartbroken simultaneously that someone had seen me even when I thought I was invisible. Grandpa let the weight of Aunt Carol's revelation settle over the room for a long moment. And then he straightened in his chair and said in a voice that carried absolute finality, "I've made some decisions that I'm announcing here with my lawyer present, so there's no confusion about my intentions or my mental competency." And he looked directly at my parents with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, something between disappointment and determination. "Emma, you already have the house. That's done, and the deed is in your name alone. And the $30,000 account I've been maintaining for you will be transferred into your control tomorrow morning. Mr. Richardson has all the paperwork ready for your signature." He paused, and I saw him glance at the lawyer who nodded confirmation. "But I'm also changing my will, effective immediately, and I want everyone here to witness this decision." My mother's face went even paler if that was possible, and my father leaned forward like he was about to protest. "My estate is currently valued at approximately $2 million, including my home, my investments, and my life insurance policies, and until today, it was set to be divided evenly between my two grandchildren, $1 million each." I felt Madison tense beside me and saw Trevor's hand find hers under the table. "That distribution no longer reflects my values or my assessment of fairness given what I've learned about how Emma has been treated for her entire life. So I'm changing the distribution to 75% for Emma and 25% for Madison." The words seemed to suck the air out of the room, and my mother made a sound like she'd been physically struck. And my father said, "Dad, you can't be serious. That's not fair to Madison. She's your granddaughter, too." But Grandpa held up his hand and said, "Fair would be giving Emma 100%, given that she's been systematically deprived and overlooked while Madison received the bulk of family resources for 26 years. But I'm being generous because I do love both of my granddaughters, and Madison is not entirely responsible for the dynamic your parenting created." I couldn't breathe, couldn't process the numbers he was saying. 75% of $2 million was $1.5 million plus the house and the savings account. And it felt surreal and overwhelming, and like maybe I was dreaming this entire evening. My mother started to say something about this being a punishment, about how they'd tried their best. But Madison's voice cut through and she said quietly, "Grandpa's right. It's fair, more than fair, actually." And everyone turned to look at her in surprise. I didn't understand how unequal everything was. I thought Mom and Dad helped us both the same way, just differently based on our needs. But hearing everything tonight, seeing the actual numbers and the actual patterns, I've gotten so much more than Emma and I didn't even realize it because it was just normal to me. Her voice was shaking and genuine tears were running down her face. Not the performative crying from earlier, but real emotion. "I feel horrible. I feel sick, actually. And I understand why Grandpa is making this change. And honestly, I think Emma deserves even more, but I'm grateful he's being generous to me at all." Trevor was nodding, his face serious. And he said, "We're going to make some changes in our own lives. I've been telling Madison for over a year that she needs to either actually monetize her platform in a real way or get a traditional job. And this is the push we needed. She's going to start job hunting next week." Uncle Jim spoke up then, his voice firm and supportive, and he said, "I think your decision is completely justified. I've watched this favoritism for years and stayed quiet because I didn't think it was my place to interfere. But Emma has always been the one who got the short end of every stick, and she deserves this recognition and this security." I sat there taking it all in, the revelations and the decisions and the shifts happening around me. And I realized that through this entire evening, I had barely spoken except to answer direct questions. That I had fallen into my familiar pattern of being silent and invisible while my life was discussed around me. And something inside me finally said enough. "I need to say something," I heard myself say, and my voice was quiet but it carried in the silence that followed, and everyone turned to look at me with varying expressions of surprise, because I think they'd forgotten I was capable of speaking for myself. "I love you all. I do. Even after everything, I still love my family. But I can't keep living like this. I can't keep being the one who doesn't matter, the one who gets forgotten and overlooked and dismissed." My hands were shaking, so I pressed them flat against the table. My 23rd birthday was completely forgotten, not a card or a call or a text. I spent it working a double shift, and then crying in my car in the hospital parking lot. And 2 months earlier, Madison's 21st birthday had a party that cost $3,000 with a custom cake and a rented venue and a photographer to document the whole thing. I saw my mother flinch, but I kept going, because if I stopped, I might never find this courage again. Last year, when my apartment was broken into and I was so terrified I couldn't sleep, when someone had gone through all my things and I felt violated and unsafe, I called you and asked if I could come stay for a few days, and you said you were too busy, that Madison was dealing with a crisis with a brand partnership that fell through. So I slept on Aunt Carol's couch for a week and had nightmares every night. Aunt Carol's eyes were wet and she reached across to squeeze my hand. 2 years ago, I was in a car accident. Someone ran a red light and hit my driver's side door. I had a concussion and 3 broken ribs, and I was in the hospital overnight for observation. And I called you from the emergency room, and you said you'd try to come by, but Madison needed you because a photo shoot had gone wrong and she was having a breakdown. And you never came. Not that night, and not the next day when they discharged me. And I took an Uber home alone and spent 3 days barely able to move by myself. I could see my father's face crumbling as I spoke, and my mother was crying again, but this time, I didn't care about her tears. Every Christmas, I spend weeks thinking about meaningful gifts for everyone, things that show I pay attention and care, and they're always brushed aside or opened last or forgotten in the pile of wrapping paper, while Madison's expensive presents that she orders online the week before are praised and appreciated and photographed for her Instagram. My voice was getting stronger as I went on. I'm done being the afterthought, the backup plan, the one who's supposed to understand and be flexible and not make waves. I'm taking the house and the money that Grandpa is giving me, and I'm setting boundaries that should have existed years ago. I looked directly at my parents. No more monthly payments. I'm not giving you $200 anymore to help with bills that apparently don't exist, since you were using my money to fund Madison's photography equipment and her content trips. And no more being available for last-minute babysitting for Madison's friends' kids while she goes to networking events that never result in actual paid work. And no more pretending that any of this is normal or okay. My mother started to speak almost immediately after I finished, her voice taking on that conciliatory tone I'd heard 1,000 times before, the one that meant she was about to apologize without actually taking responsibility, and she said, "Emma, sweetheart, I didn't realize you felt this way. I had no idea you were holding on to all this hurt." And something inside me just snapped because she was doing it again. She was rewriting reality right in front of witnesses who had just heard the entire truth laid out. "You did know," I said, and my voice was steady, even though my heart was pounding. "I've told you how I felt dozens of times over the years. You just didn't listen, or you didn't care enough to remember." I looked at her directly and saw her face shift into defensive mode. "After the hospital incident with the car accident, when I got home and you finally called 3 days later, I told you how much it hurt that you didn't come, and you changed the subject to Madison's problems with some brand deal. You literally interrupted me mid-sentence to talk about her." My father was shaking his head like he wanted to deny it, but I kept going. "After my 23rd birthday that you completely forgot. I came over for dinner the next week, and I mentioned feeling hurt that no one remembered, and you told me I was being too sensitive, that birthdays weren't that important at my age, and then you spent 20 minutes showing me photos from Madison's birthday party 2 months earlier." My mother opened her mouth to protest, but I wasn't done. "Last Christmas, when I tried to talk to you about feeling like my gifts and my presents didn't matter, when I tried to explain that it hurt to always be an afterthought, you told me I was being jealous of Madison and that I needed to be happy for my sister's success instead of tearing her down." I saw Madison wince at that because she was hearing for the first time how our parents had framed my pain as jealousy rather than legitimate hurt. "You've gaslit me for years, telling me my feelings weren't real, that I was remembering things wrong, that I was too sensitive or too jealous or too demanding, anything to avoid actually acknowledging that you treated me like I didn't matter." My father finally spoke, and his voice was rougher than I'd ever heard it, and he said, "Emma, I think I'm starting to understand how badly we failed you. I'm seeing it now, and I'm so sorry." And there was something in his face that looked like genuine devastation, like maybe he was actually processing the scope of the damage for the first time. But my mother was still making excuses, still trying to justify and explain, saying, "We did our best with both of you. We loved you both equally. We just had different parenting approaches for different personalities. And Grandpa's voice cut through firm and final, and he said, "Enough. The evidence speaks for itself, and my decisions stand. This meeting is over." He looked at Mr. Richardson, who nodded and began gathering his papers. "Emma is moving into her house next weekend, and I'll be helping her with the move. The $30,000 account will be transferred to her name tomorrow, and my updated will is being filed with Mr. Richardson's office and with my bank to ensure there's no confusion about my intentions or my mental state when these decisions were made." The lawyer confirmed, "Everything is legally sound and properly documented. Mr. Peterson's wishes are clear and will be executed exactly as he specified." And I felt the finality of it settle over the room like a blanket. The family began to disperse in an uncomfortable silence that felt thick enough to cut. Madison and Trevor leaving first, with Madison giving me a look that seemed genuinely apologetic. Aunt Carol hugging me tight and whispering, "I'm so proud of you," before she and Uncle Jim headed out, and my parents gathering their things slowly, like they wanted to say something else but couldn't find the words. And finally they left too, without the usual round of goodbyes and see you soons, because nobody knew what our relationship would look like after tonight, or if there would even be a relationship to maintain. 2 weeks later, I was standing in my new living room, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, and feeling something I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember. Something that took me a while to identify as safety, as peace, as the bone-deep knowledge that I was finally in a space that was truly mine. Aunt Carol had shown up on moving day with her truck and her husband Jim, and they'd spent 8 hours helping me transport my meager belongings from that tiny apartment where I'd heard gunshots and sirens every night, and she'd brought housewarming gifts too. Practical things like a toolkit and a fire extinguisher, and a beautiful set of kitchen towels that she said reminded her of me because they were sturdy and reliable and would last forever. The real surprise came on day 3 in the new house when my doorbell rang, and I opened it to find Madison and Trevor standing there looking genuinely uncomfortable. And Madison was holding an envelope, and she said, "Can we come in for just a minute? We won't stay long. We just need to give you something." And I let them in, even though I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever this was. Trevor did most of the talking because Madison seemed like she might cry, and he handed me the envelope and said, "We've been doing a lot of thinking since that meeting at your grandpa's house, and I went back through our finances and calculated how much you sent to your parents over the past 2 years, $200 a month for 24 months, and that's $4,800 that you gave them while you were struggling and living in an unsafe neighborhood and eating ramen for dinner half the week." And when I opened the envelope, there was a check for exactly that amount, $4,800. And I just stared at it because I'd never expected to see that money again. Madison finally spoke, and her voice was shaky, and she said, "I'm so sorry, Emma. I really didn't know they were taking money from you. I didn't know about so many things, and I'm looking for a real job now. Trevor and I talked, and he's right that I need to actually contribute and support myself instead of pretending Instagram is going to magically turn into a career." And there was something in her face that seemed genuinely remorseful, genuinely shaken by the revelations of that family meeting. They didn't stay long, maybe 15 minutes, and the conversation was awkward but not hostile. And after they left, I sat on my second-hand couch in my beautiful house and cried while holding that check. Because it wasn't really about the money, it was about someone in my family, besides Grandpa and Aunt Carol, actually acknowledging that I'd been hurt and trying to make even a small part of it right. My parents had sent a text apology 2 days after the meeting, a long message full of, "We're sorry you felt hurt," and "We never meant to make you feel less important," and other non-apologies that didn't actually take responsibility. And I'd read it 3 times and then left it unread because I wasn't ready to respond, and I didn't know if I ever would be. I spent the next week settling in, furnishing the basics with some of the money Grandpa had given me, painting the spare bedroom a soft blue that made me think of sky and possibility, planting flowers in the garden even though it was late in the season and I didn't really know what I was doing, just pushing bulbs into the earth and hoping something beautiful would grow. My coworkers from the hospital came over for a small housewarming party, just pizza and wine and laughter in my living room. And my friend Jennifer, who worked in the ER with me, kept saying, "Emma, you have a house, an actual house. I'm so happy for you I could cry." And it felt good to celebrate with people who genuinely cared about my happiness without any complicated family history attached. I felt safe for the first time in years, safe in a way that went beyond just having secure locks and living in a neighborhood where I didn't hear violence outside my window, safe in the knowledge that this space was mine and no one could take it away or use it as leverage or hold it over my head. Grandpa came to visit on a sunny afternoon about 10 days after I'd moved in, and he brought a large box that he carried carefully through my front door, and when he set it on my kitchen table and opened it, I saw my grandmother's china inside. The delicate cream-colored plates with the tiny blue flowers that I remembered from childhood, visits to their house. "Your grandmother would want you to have these," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She always said family heirlooms should go to the family members who would treasure them and use them and understand their value, and that's you, Emma. That's always been you." We had tea together in my kitchen, using those beautiful cups that had belonged to the grandmother I'd loved so much. And Grandpa apologized again for not seeing the situation sooner, for not understanding how deeply the favoritism ran. And I told him what I'd come to understand in the quiet nights in my new house, which was that he'd fixed it as soon as he knew, that he'd stood up for me and given me not just financial support, but the validation I'd been starving for my entire life. "You saw me," I said simply, "when it mattered most. You actually saw me and you believed me and you did something about it, and that's more than enough. That's everything." 3 months had passed since I moved into the house, and standing in my kitchen on a quiet Sunday morning making coffee in my grandmother's china cups, I realized that I was thriving in a way I'd never imagined possible. Thriving in a way that went beyond just having a safe place to live or financial stability. Thriving in the bone-deep sense of finally being at peace with myself and my place in the world. The house had become truly home in those months, every room reflecting choices I'd made for myself without having to justify or explain or make myself smaller to accommodate someone else's needs. My garden was blooming with the bulbs I'd planted in late-season uncertainty, bright tulips and daffodils pushing up through the earth like small miracles, and I'd added a vegetable patch too, tomatoes and herbs and lettuce that I tended in the evenings after my shifts at the hospital. I'd used some of the money Grandpa had given me to take online courses for career advancement, certification programs in trauma nursing and pediatric care that would open up new opportunities and increase my salary. And I discovered that I loved learning when I wasn't doing it while working 3 jobs and surviving on 4 hours of sleep and constant anxiety about making rent. I'd established firm boundaries with my parents after weeks of consideration and several therapy sessions that I could finally afford, settling on low contact that meant brief phone calls every few weeks and attendance at major family events if I felt up to it. But no financial help flowing in either direction, and no more emergency babysitting or last-minute favors, or putting myself aside to accommodate their requests. My mother still didn't really understand why I was being distant, as she put it. Still occasionally sent texts that tried to rewrite history or minimize what had happened. But my father had been making genuine efforts, sending me articles about nursing innovations he'd seen, remembering to ask about my work, showing up in small ways he'd never managed before. Madison and I had texted occasionally over the 3 months, our relationship settling into something cordial but distant, like acquaintances who shared a complicated history but were building separate lives, and she'd sent me a photo 2 weeks ago of her first day at a marketing firm where she'd gotten a junior position, genuine employment that Trevor had helped her find, and that she seemed cautiously excited about. Trevor himself had surprised me by sending information about financial planning and investment strategies, emails with subject lines like, "Thought you might find this useful," that contained genuinely helpful advice about what to do with the money I was saving now that I owned my home outright, and had no rent payment eating up half my income. Aunt Carol and Uncle Jim had become regular fixtures in my life, coming over for dinner every couple of weeks, helping me paint the basement, teaching me about home maintenance and gardening and all the things I'd never learned because I'd been too busy surviving to think about thriving. Grandpa came for Sunday dinners that I cooked in my beautiful kitchen, and we'd established a rhythm where he'd arrive at 4 and we'd cook together, him sharing my grandmother's recipes and stories about their life together, me soaking up this connection to family history that felt pure and uncomplicated and freely given. I'd started dating someone too, a doctor named Marcus from the hospital who worked in the emergency department and who'd asked me out after we'd worked a particularly difficult trauma case together. And what struck me most about being with him was how easy it felt, how he actually listened when I talked and remembered details about my life and valued my opinions and never made me feel like I was too much or not enough or anything other than exactly right as I was. As I stood in my garden one evening at sunset 3 months to the day after I'd moved in, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink and gold, I reflected on the magnitude of the change in my life and in my understanding of myself. I had spent 28 years trying to earn love that should have been freely given, contorting myself into shapes that might finally be worthy of my parents' attention and affection, working harder and achieving more, and making myself useful in the desperate hope that someday they would see me the way they saw Madison, that someday I would be enough. But standing there with dirt under my fingernails and flowers blooming around me, and the solid weight of my own house at my back, I finally understood that my worth had never been determined by their recognition, that I had always been enough, and their failure to see it was about their limitations, not mine. The house wasn't just shelter or financial security, though it was certainly both of those things, and I was grateful for them every single day. The house was a symbol of being seen, of being valued, of mattering to someone who had looked at me and recognized something worth investing in, worth protecting, worth loving. Grandpa had given me more than walls and a roof and a garden. He'd given me proof that I deserved good things, that my worth was real and observable and true. I belonged to myself now in a way I never had before, not waiting for permission or validation or scraps of affection from people who had never learned how to love me properly. I belonged to myself, and I was learning that that was enough, that it was actually everything, that the peace I felt standing in my garden, watching the sunset over my own small piece of earth, was worth more than all the years I'd spent chasing recognition from people who were determined not to see me. That was enough. I was enough. Finally, completely undeniably enough.